This is going to be all about how do you conduct an amazing interview, not just from the content perspective, but from a building a relationship perspective. This is also can train you on doing an interview. If you have another interviewer also going to be hosting the show, this can train them. So definitely have them watch this. So you're going to start off, just to start from the beginning, in your membership dashboard. And the way you're going to have your customized master interview template. And the way you're going to get to it is you're just going to click right here. And this is going to be your master interview template. This is mine. So I'm going to walk you through what you do. And we're going to go through step by step. Now, there will be individual Rise 25 University modules on certain aspects of this. So this is going to run through every single piece of the interview process. If you want to just see one particular piece, you'll be able to just access that one video. So search in, if you're looking for it, you can search in the Rise 25 University right here and just search in during the interview, and that module will probably be in there. But we're going to go it from the very beginning to the end in this particular video. So the first thing you're going to start off with is you're going to be in your template, and the instructions are very clear. And as far as each time I do an interview, and we recommend doing, is following these instructions. Before you proceed, make a copy of your template so that you can actually make individual notes for that particular guest, okay? And all you have to do is follow these instructions for every new interview. Go to File, make a copy, and for the name, insert the name. So if I was doing mine, I would go here, make a file, make a copy, and I would take off the word template, and I would insert the name on here. Joe Smith with Google, whatever the name of the company is. And I'd make a copy. I'd share with the same people, make a copy. Okay. So just follow that first. And you should have a separate document for each interview because you're going to make individual notes there, and you can fill in further details below. Now, how to rock an interview. All right. How do you rock an interview? This section is audience feedback always tells us to go light on advice, heavy in examples. So when you're having someone on, you want them to tell great stories. And if you think of your favorite movie or autobiography, it's full of great stories. So how do you make sure that your guests share great stories? Well, part of that is planning the interview with them and asking them great questions, because great questions can elicit great stories. So you'll see in this part of the pre-interview right here, how this is going to help you plan and rock an interview, okay? So you want to make sure that you help them weave their stories inside the episode. And that goes with, you're going to get some stories ahead of time, right? You're going to plan it. So whenever someone says to me, hey, can you send questions? I say, don't worry. We're going to plan the episode out together before we hit record. But I just tell them, think of, 2, 3 or more of your favorite stories from your journey that you can talk about. So I just prompt them to think of some stories. And then people ask us a lot of times, how do you research the guest ahead of time? I actually do quite a bit of research, but at a minimum, I say, Google the person's name, okay? Check out their website, check out their about page, and check out their LinkedIn page, okay? If you want to go deeper, search for them on YouTube and watch a few videos. Typically what I'll do is I'll watch the videos on 2 times speed so I can get through it a little bit more, okay? But you can find some great details on their about page, on their LinkedIn page, and their LinkedIn profile, and you can see achievements, milestones, and a bunch of other things. And I just look through everything as far as their LinkedIn page, and I see where they went to school. I see what their major was in school. You can see a lot of details. You could see their career path, what jobs they had, and then what businesses they had before. So you can see quite a bit of information on their LinkedIn page. So doing research, I'll say, hey, I saw, Joe, you were an art history major. How did you get into starting the SaaS business? And they're really impressed with, how did I even know that? Well, I just really looked at their LinkedIn page. So how do you rock an interview? You will prep them in the pre-interview, but you can also take a look at their LinkedIn page and their About page, okay? And if you want to go further, watch a few videos. A little bit of research goes a long way, right? The next section is the pre-interview with a guest, and this is integral into a successful podcast interview. So the pre-interview with the guest, okay, the pre-interview with the guest is, I follow this step by step and I read this verbatim, right? So I used to, many years ago, help one show, and there were 45 to 60 minute pre-interviews, okay? This is the 4-minute version, and you do it right before you conduct the interview. So you're going to do this, and then you'll hit record. So the person is prepped, they're ready, and then you go. So when I get on with someone, I will, chit chat with them a little bit about how, what's going on today, how's your day going, and then after a minute or two, just chatting. And usually I'll find something in common. I'll find something on their LinkedIn page like, hey, by the way, I also went to University of Wisconsin, or whatever that commonality is. Or maybe I listened to their book and read their book and want to tell them about it. So we'll chit chat for a minute or two, and then, just bond with them and show my interest level in why we're doing the interview. And then I get into, listen, before we hit record here, I just have a few questions, right? And this is when I transition into reading my pre-interview script here. So 1, I want to respect your time and keep eyeing the clock. What time do you need to be done? Right? Or I'll say, do you have a hard stop before the hour mark that I should know about? Right? And what this I'm demonstrating here is, first, I just want to show respect right off the bat and respect the person's time. And I want to know if they have a hard stop. Sometimes, like, I have to get to this meeting. I'd really appreciate it if we can end 5 minutes before. That's good to know, so that they can feel comfortable and they can just relax during the interview. The second is collaboration. If the person's asking questions, they're like, I want to explore a conversation, a collaboration afterwards. You want to leave enough time after the interview to collaborate. I mean, you could always schedule another call, but leaving some time right afterwards to collaborate is always good. And then third is, you get a sense of their personality, right? I've had really successful, one guy, he started 3 9-figure companies. And I was like, he's going to be so busy. He's going to have to jump right off. And I asked him this question: what time do you need to be done, or do you have a hard stop? And it was at noon. So from noon to 1, he's like, Jeremy, I have till 5 p.m. So he was just super laid back. I was like, oh, cool. We won't quite go that long, but thank you. So that's the first question. The second is, I want to make sure, Mary, we share and talk about what's top of mind for you. What do you want to make sure that we talk about? Right? And this is a key question. This helps you plan. This number 2 helps you plan the whole interview. And again, I'm just reading right off of the pre-interview script. So, Mary, I want to share what's top of mind for you in the business. What do you want to make sure we talk about today? And usually they have 2 or 3 things that they want to talk about. You know what? I've been really thinking about, marketing and how it relates to authenticity, or whatever someone says. And typically I keep iPad in front of me. You could just keep a piece of paper, and I jot a couple notes down, right? I could even pull up past notes to see what someone said. The last person I had on said, I want to talk about people and recruiting. I want to talk about the evolution of our services. And I want to talk about our core values and what we're doing with our core values in hiring. Okay. So just a few things. And each time I say one thing, I go, what else is top of mind? What are you thinking about in the business? The next question I ask, and again, I'm jotting 2 or 3 or 4 things down. The next question is, what's a great case study from your company, or a favorite story we can talk about from your company? All right. Because oftentimes they have and I tell them, don't tell me the whole story. I just need enough information to cue you up to tell the story. And if it's about a client, I always tell them, listen, if you can't mention the client's name, we could just say, hey, it's a big tech company, if you don't have their approval to use their name, right? Most of the companies, a lot of the companies want people using their name because it's more publicity for them. But if you don't have the authority to do it and you're worried about it, don't mention the name and just say, hey, we had this, just tell the person, just say, hey, you have this big tech company and here's what we did with them, So you want to get a few case studies and say, what are 2 or 3 of your favorite that stick out? All right. And for this particular person, we mentioned a couple. Actually, one of their clients was Steve Madden. Another was an oncology lab. So he mentioned 3 case studies that were great to talk about. And I said, great. If the person goes in to starts to tell the story, I kind of stop them and go, hey, let's keep it fresh for the interview. I want to hear it for the first time on the interview so you don't feel like you're retelling it. So typically I have a couple bullets here, and then I have a couple case studies or favorite stories from the journey, right? And this right there makes a great 20 to 30 minute interview, right? They're sharing what's top of mind for them, what they've really thought about, and what's a few of their favorite case studies. And case studies, I just want to say, when you allow someone to highlight their favorite case studies, all right, and stories, they're going to be really proud of the interview because they're talking about their success, right? So that allows you to plan the whole thing. So even after doing thousands and thousands of interviews, and if I'm nervous for one, I just have to go back to, don't worry, Jeremy, just do the pre-interview process and you will plan out a great interview with the guest. And they feel comfortable too because they're planning it with you. Okay. So that's number 1 of the pre-interview process. Then number 2 helps you plan the content. And number 3 is basically just simply explaining to the guest the format. Hey, Joe, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a brief introduction, a brief sponsor message. I'm going to read your intro, and then we'll get started. Then I'm going to launch into the first question. And usually I just tell them, hey, the first question is going to be super simple. It's going to be about, I'm going to ask you your company and what you do, right? And that gets them started. That gets them rolling in what they actually do, right? And then step 4 reminds me if I want to get the pronunciation of their name, if it's a hard name to say. So I always, because going back to in this process, I'm going to walk through this introduction of the guest. When I have them fill out a Calendly, which you can check out my Calendly at inspiredinsider.com/schedule, there is a spot for them to enter in a Rockstar bio for them that I should read. So I just simply take it right out of the calendar and I paste it into this section. But if I want to make sure I get their name pronounced right, so I will basically say it to them, make sure I phonetically spell it out. Okay. That's number 4. Number 5 is kind of a next level piece of the pre-interview. What makes it really memorable for the guest is not only them telling their great stories and sharing their knowledge, but allowing them to share with their network and some of the people in their network and mention their network and show some love to their network. So this is a question I'll ask is like, hey, Mary, who's an important client, partner, or champion of yours or mentor that we should make sure to mention on this interview today? They'll love it that you mention them. Who should we mention? And sometimes they have a few names, and it allows me to follow up with a question of, what did you learn from that person? Or what did that person teach you? Or how does that person evolve in the company? And it opens up to another great channel of questions. So you can ask the person also, who are some of your great partners? Who's a champion and in your world, or who's a mentor, right? This is the number 5. Now, the last step, which people have forgotten to do, and that's why it's here, is I'm going to hit record. Don't forget to hit record because you go through all this work, all this time, all this energy, and then people have forgotten to hit record. So I read this verbatim. Hey, Mary, I'm going to hit record and test the mic. Then I play, if you're using, just whatever tool you're normally using, which is a lot of people use Zoom or other tools, whatever it is, just hit record. And then I will watch for that blinking light that is recording. And I will say, testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2. okay, Mary, talk on your end, and they'll say testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2. If they are quiet or something you need to correct, at that point you can say, hey, it gives you the opportunity to say, hey, you're a little quiet, or hey, move your camera. And here you can give them a little guidance if things are off. Okay. But that's the pre-interview process. Okay. Respect, number one, I want to respect your time and keep eyeing the clock. What time do you need to be done? Number two, I want to make sure that we share and talk about what's top of mind for you. What do you want to make sure that we mention or talk about? And then next is, what's a great case study or few that we should talk about? I always like to get 2 or 3, and because I want this to be a big win for you. And then third is telling them what you're going to do as far as the format goes. And then fourth is making sure to get their name right. And fifth is allowing them to give to any people in their network. And then sixth, don't forget to hit record, right? That is the pre-interview portion. Now, next is the interview. So now that, okay, you hit record, you testing 1, 2, talk on your end, testing 1, 2, great, let's get going. And right after that, I am saying going right into the introduction, right? You could see on this part is an example of the introduction that I do. And this is where your introduction will already be here, so you can read it, right? But right after the blinking light, part of the interview. Dr. Jeremy Weiss here. I'm the host of InspiredInsider.com, where I focus and talk to some of the top entrepreneurs and leaders on this planet. Okay, that's the first part of the introduction. The next is, this is, again, a lot of people skip this part, but this is so critically important, which is right after you read your intro, mention past guests. Okay, mention past guests. And there's a couple reasons to mention past guests here. So after this, I may say, hey, Mary, before I introduce you formally, I always like to mention other guests that have been on the podcast that people should check out. And you could check out I had the co-founder of Pixar, and I had the founder of Atari and P90X, and you could list several names. There's a couple reasons for making sure to list past guests. Okay. One, and you could read it all here. One is, it points your listeners to more great content. So if they're listening to it, they're like, oh, wow, that sounds really interesting. And by the way, some of the guests that I've had on will write down and go, oh, I have to check that one out that you did. Two, it can be instant credibility that you have had with other important people. So, it just shows that you've had other great guests on. So the guest feels like, oh, wow, I'm in good company. So it can create instant credibility. It doesn't even have to be a super well-known person or company. It could be like, hey, I had Joe Smith who grew his company to 9 figures or whatever the case is, that maybe no one has heard of that person, but they've accomplished something incredibly successful in their business. Or it could be an inspirational story. Talk about, and mention a guest that you've had on. Or it could be a cool topic, but it gives you credibility and they're a good company. The third is, it gives you another reason to reach out to a past guest to tell them you mentioned their name and their company. And you give them a shout out, and they're going to love you for it. So I sometimes in my interview, in this area template, I will have 5 guests that I like to, or 5 or 6 guests that I've listed there, and I'll try and mention 3 or 4. Okay. And these people are my biggest champions, and they're people I want to just keep shouting out and giving love to on episodes. And by the way, each time I do that, I message them and tell them, I may text them, I may voice text them, I may email them and say, hey, Ian, I gave you some love today in the episode. I mentioned you again. Hey, Ian. And I may do that for 5 weeks in a row for different guests, or 5 interviews in a row. But I will let them know that I'm mentioning them. So it's really important. You can show some love right here. And it's a great follow-up to people in your universe that you want to keep, bring top of mind and show some love. So make sure that you mention past guests. Okay. So it's the introduction, and then past guests, right? The next section, again, this is only a section, we'll interview clients for thought leadership, your thought leadership. And we do that. This is what you read, because we're the guest interviewer for those episodes. But if it's for an external guest that you're having on, you can skip over this section because this section is only for the thought leadership piece when Rise 25, when we're co-hosting and interviewing you for your expertise. Okay. So if you have an external guest, skip over this section and go right to the sponsorship section. Okay. There's some key components to the sponsorship section, right? So after you read the intro, Dr. Jeremy Weiss here, I'm the host of InspiredInsider.com, and you mentioned past guests, I'll say this episode is brought to you by, okay? And there's different sections of the sponsorship message, okay? So we'll go into the sponsorship message in some of the most important parts of the sponsorship message next, and then we'll put it all together. But, the goal is obviously you're using your own business as the sponsor of the podcast, okay? Your business is underwriting this initiative, therefore it should be the sponsor. Now, an outside sponsor may pay you pennies, while they make dollars. So we always recommend using your own business as a sponsor to maximize your earning power. Okay. Now we'll go into how you can. I don't sell sponsorships, but I will give away sponsorships to my biggest champions and friends and colleagues. And I'll show you how that works in a second. But that's never to replace my company's sponsorship message. We're always going to be the sponsor. Okay. So here's the components of a great sponsorship message. One, obviously, you talk about this is brought to you by, and here's my company and what I do. The next piece of the sponsorship message is to address the guests that you're having on, right? You want to involve them in the sponsorship message, right? So listen, Mary, you're talking directly to them here. So the first part is what your company does, what you do. And then next is addressing the guest. And then the next section is speaking from the heart. And it could be a case study as well. Okay. And then the last part is a call to action. Where do you want to send people? What do you want them to do? Obviously we recommend checking out your website and an email. Okay. Keeping it simple so that people can actually get in touch with you. All right. So an example of these sections is from ours. You can see right here on the side is, hey, this episode is brought to you by Rise 25. At Rise 25, we help B2B businesses connect to their Dream 100 clients and referral partners. And we create a systemized incoming referral pipeline, which generates ROI using a podcast. We are an easy button for a company to launch and run a podcast. We are strategy, we're accountability, and we're full execution of that podcast. Say, listen, Joe, let me tell you something. The number one thing in my life is relationships. And I'm always looking at ways to give to my best relationships. And I found no better way to do that than the profile of the people and companies I most admire on this planet. So if you've thought about podcasting, you should. If you have questions, go to rise25.com or email us at support@rise25.com. Right. One of our most popular episodes is actually the 5 different types of episodes every podcast should create. So if you have questions, you can check that episode out also. All right. So there's the sponsorship message. And those are the components. I said what we do. I address the guest and involve them. And then I spoke from the heart of why, how relationships are so important to me. And I love giving to my relationships by profiling the people on my podcast. And then I had a call to action. My call to action I sent to my website, and I had an email. And I also just mentioned an episode we did that would be a great piece of content that people could check out to get to know us further. So that's an example of a sponsor message. Now, if I were to give away a sponsor message, I could do that. And you can give away a sponsorship message to some of your most important champions. So let's say you have a referral partner that refers you all the time, and you can give them a sponsorship without even obviously not charging them, but also just letting them know that after the fact, you can ask them before too and go, hey, Tom, I want to get, you guys are so good to me. You always are referring us people. I'd love to give you a sponsorship to our next 3 episodes on my podcast. Can you send me like a 3-sentence, bio that I should read for your company? Okay. they'll be like, oh, wow, thank you. And then after I read that sponsor message for that episode, I will message them and let them know. Okay. And I will put it after mine. After I read mine, I'll say, and also just want to let you know, we have another great partner. His name's Tom Smith. Here's what his company does. And I could add it on to the sponsor message if I choose. Right. But if you just want to have yours, totally fine. Remember, an outside sponsor is not to replace yours. You always want yours on there because you are footing the bill and you're underwriting this whole process. Right. So that is the sponsorship message. Right. The next piece is the introduction of your guest. Okay. There's a couple key components to the introduction of your guest. First of all, there's a area here that should remind you of how did you meet this guest? Were they referred to you? Did you meet him through an event, through a conference, through an online group? How did you meet this person? Because you want to give a shout out to that company or individual that allowed you to meet this person. All right. So you want to thank that referral first. So I will say, and I'll put this all together for you, but if, before I introduce Joe Smith, I just want to give a big thank you to, and fill in the name of that person or organization, to Mary from the website so-and-so. They specialize in XYZ. Thanks, Mary, for thinking of us, and thanks for introducing today's guest. And then I'm going to go into introduce today's guest. Now, for the introduction of the guest, I have them fill out their bio onto my calendar. So you can check it out, inspiredinsider.com/schedule. One of the questions and how I, word it, which is, please include a 3 to 4 sentence Rockstar bio that I can read on the front of the interview. If I say it specifically like that, because if I just said, can you include a bio? People don't take it as seriously, but if I say, I'm going to read this to make you sound like a rock star on the front end of the interview, they actually take it seriously and craft something. So the introduction of the guest would go something like, hey, before introducing today's guest, I want to give a big thank you to John Corcoran. Go check out their website at rise25.com. They specialize in helping B2B businesses reach their dream 100 people using a podcast, because he introduces today's guest, Jay Steinfeld. Jay Steinfeld, and then I'll go into Jay Steinfeld is the founder of blinds.com. He set up the original e-commerce site, No Brainer Blinds, for $3,000 in 1996, and has since grown the e-commerce company to over $200 million in revenue and sold to Home Depot. All right. So that is the introduction of the guest. Make sure that you give a shout out. Now, even if, let's say, you reached out to the guest and you knew them, how did you get to know them? How did you meet them? Did you meet them through a conference? Like, hey, I remember I met Susan at a conference, this e-commerce conference called XYZ, and thank you for that conference for putting it on, because I wouldn't have met Susan. You can actually then reach out to that conference and say, hey, I give you a shout out on my podcast. So the more people and companies you can mention and show some love to, the better, and let them know that you did. So there's a lot that's even in the introduction of your guest that you can give a shout out in general to anyone you want. You go, hey, before I introduce Susan, like, we have a couple mutual friends, so-and-so and so-and-so. So any opportunity to mention other people and companies, I recommend it. All right. So this is the section that's your introduction of your guest, and it's mission critical to give a shout out to some people on this section. Right. And if you want to make it easy on yourself and you don't want to have to kind of look at their about page and LinkedIn page and come up with an introduction, have the guest fill it out on the scheduling. We use Calendly, but you could use anything and have it as one of your questions, right? So that's the introduction part, right? Just right there, there's so much powerful stuff in this initial stage. So just to recap a little bit, so you can see it and go through it. After the pre-interview, you hit record, and then you go into the intro, and then you go into the sponsor message, and then you give some shout outs and introduce your guest. And now you're in the interview section. Okay. So let's look at the interview section, right? The interview section here, the content piece, there's the main part of the interview and then the final question. right? So remember, in this interview section, you already did the pre-interview here in the interview section. And the pre-interview the second part is asking the person what's top of mind for them. What do you want to make sure they talk about? And also a couple great case studies that you can talk about. So right now you've already have, probably 4 to 7 bullets that you can create an amazing piece of content. So this is additional questions if you feel you want to ask them as like a fallback questions. This is not just, these questions we have found elicit great stories, right? That's why we have them here. So you can use this and keep this as a fallback. If you like some of them, keep them. If you're in your template and you don't like them, feel free to delete them because they're your template, right? So what I want to point out here is you already have planned out the episode in the pre-interview, but you may like some of these questions. So you may add them in, or you may have a couple industry questions that you may want to ask. Let's say you work with e-commerce companies and you want to know what their favorite e-commerce brands are that they like or whatever it is. So you may have a couple industry related questions, but for the most part, you've already planned this in the pre-interview. And these are good questions as an add-on. So here's some of the questions that we have found. There's business and personal. We have found elicit really good stories. And by the way, with this is not meant to follow step by step. You can pick and choose which ones you like. Yeah, you could throw a dart at any of these and use them in the middle of an interview. Let's say there's a lull in the interview. I could say, hey, you know what, Mary? Tell me, what are some of the big milestones in your, the journey of your company that you're especially proud of, or in your career that you're especially proud of? I just chose 5 at random, right? And I can use it in the middle of a conversation. So these are not meant to follow step by step. Now you can, if you wanted, if someone just wanted to follow this format, it'd be a rock solid interview, but it would also be pretty long. So just use the ones you like, and you could eliminate the ones you don't. But so here's a couple of the questions we have found that elicit really good stories. So how did you get started? I remember I had the co-founder of Pixar on, okay? And I asked this question: how did Pixar get started? How'd you get started? And he went on for 20 minutes telling the most incredible stories about Steve Jobs and George Lucas and what went on and how Pixar got started. So these are some business related questions. How'd you get started? Where'd the idea come from? What were the early days of your career or company like? What were the biggest turning points in your company? What were some big milestones you're proud of? What gave you the most traction and results? What's a big mistake or pitfall that you learned a lot from? And you try and get a story. So examples may be a partnership pitfall, a hiring pitfall, a product pitfall, a customer pitfall, a marketing pitfall. So there's a few examples. Next would be, what's a big challenge you had to overcome, personally or professionally? What's a proud moment? When you look back, what's been especially proud moment of the company or career or whatever? And this will kind of relate back to the final question in a second, but who are your mentors and the best piece of advice? You can ask someone, what are a few of your daily rituals that you find most important? What's a typical day? And from a personal side, if you want to think of some personal questions, and this, you can prep someone ahead of time or not, but I at one point prepped some people on what's a strange, like some really well-known, more famous guests. I like to ask, like, what's a strange hobby you have or a quirk, because it humanizes them a bit. So what do most people not know about you? What's a strange quirk or a strange habit or hobby? And I'll ask them usually ahead of time just to prep them. What's the craziest thing you've ever done? Where are you from? What was it like growing up? So, someone's from, let's say they live in New York City and they grew up in rural Iowa. I was like, what was it like living in rural Iowa now that you're in New York City? Or sometimes I like to ask, you are a top agency owner now. I'm sure when you were 9, that wasn't something you were like, I want to be an agency owner when I grow up. What did you want to do when you grew up? So that's another question. So this is part of the interview questions. And we went back to the, how do you rock an interview, which is have the guest tell stories. So you've planned it in the pre-interview, and these are questions help elicit points in time. If you find a guest is being more general, like, you know what, my marketing, and they don't give a specific example. When I was successful, my marketing, appealed to everyone. So you could say, hey, can you tell me a time when your marketing you felt appealed to everyone? Or tell me when you worked with a client who, when you get them to a point in time, they tell a story and it's engaging. So those are a few pieces from the interview question section. But if you've done the pre-interview properly, you have a Rockstar interview ready to go. And this you can just add on. So the next part of the interview is the final question, right? So the final question part, this is a really important part of the interview, right? One, remember in the pre-interview, you ask them if they had a hard stop before the hour or they have to be done at a certain time. So you want to make sure to stick to that. So the final question serves a couple of purposes. The final question creates great content and resources for your audience, and you'll see why. 2, the final question can create warm introductions to cold in people for you. And 3rd is it makes it less awkward to end the interview, right? So here's an example. Okay, you're coming up on time. So you're going to need to end the interview soon. But you can end the interview at any point because you're going to go with the final question. Okay? Oh my gosh, the interview's going to end soon. I got to end this thing. You don't want to be awkward. Like, okay, we're all done here. So here's a way to transition. Listen, Mary, I have one last question. Okay. Before I ask it, I want to point people to your website at www.blah.com, and everyone check it out and check out more episodes of the podcast. So here's my last question. So right then and there, I have told them that this is the last question and we're going to be ending. Okay. And you can pull this out at any moment. So the next part is the final question. And the final question, here's a couple examples of final questions. You don't have to use these, but here's what we have found are really good final questions. One is, who are colleagues that you most respect in your industry? And you can use a couple if you want. My final 2 questions or whatever. Who are colleagues that you most respect in your industry and why? So if that person's respectable and noteworthy, most likely the colleagues that they respect are also noteworthy. So and by the way, it doesn't force a person to say someone they even may know personally. They may not know the person, but they just respect them. So if you have someone on, they go, oh, and they mention a couple colleagues, you can then go to LinkedIn or that person's website and say, hey, by the way, I just had, Mary Smith on, and she said you were one of the most respected colleagues she has in the industry, just letting you know. Okay. When you do that, that person's going to love it. And you can share the episode with them too. Right. And if and when they respond to you, you can say, hey, you know what? Would you be open to coming on my show? I'd love to have you on. If that person respects you, then I would love to have you on. Right. So you're creating a warm introduction. So who are colleagues that you most respect in your industry? Another question people ask is, what are your favorite podcasts in the space, right? So they may suggest a few podcasts, and you could reach out to that podcast host and say, hey, so-and-so mentioned they love your podcast. Now, they may mention your podcast on theirs because of this. Who knows the collaboration that you have? Maybe you have that person on the podcast. Maybe they suggest you guests that they had on for you, right? So there's a lot of collaboration. Another question is your favorite conference. Hey, what are some of your favorite conferences? I know you're in the e-commerce space, what are your favorite conferences? And they mention a few conferences. Remember, this is great content. People in that industry would love to hear what conferences that some of the, successful people are going to. And you can then reach out to those conferences and say, hey, by the way, I've had 3 guests mention your conference. I love to, it's almost like a sponsorship message. I love to give you a sponsorship message. Who are some of the speakers at your next show that I should have on, or some of the people that you recommend? And you could ask them for recommendations. Who do you think I should have on? So you can get guest suggestions from the conference, have the conference organizers on your show. There's a lot of different ways you can collaborate. Okay. You can then, another question is your mentors and their best advice. Who are some of your mentors and best advice? I remember I had on a venture capitalist, and he mentioned one of his mentors who started a $1 billion company. And he mentioned his name on the episode. And I said, hey, and right then and there, I said, hey, so-and-so seems like they'd be a great guest on the show. You think they'd be up for us? Yeah, I'd make an introduction. I'm happy to make an introduction. This is all recorded on the show. So he talked about his mentor and his best advice. And then I reached out, and then he introduced me directly to the mentor. But I also, said, hey, after it went live, I said, hey, here's, they talked about you and you're their mentor and their best advice that you gave them. And they really appreciated that. Then another one is your favorite tools and software, right? What are your favorite tools or software? Or, that also leads to industry related talk. So if someone uses, like in e-commerce example, there's a lot of examples, but like, what are your favorite software you use in your company? Well, a lot of times it's going to be possible collaboration partners or referral partners or people who have introductions as well. So there's some examples of final questions, and make sure with the final question is to make a note. And after, you'll see in the post-interview collaboration conversation, you can ask that person to say, hey, like, would you mind making an intro? I think that person would be a great guest. Of course, I'll make sure to give you a shout out. And remember, go back to the section where in the first part where you introduce the guest, you want to give the shout out to the person who ever mentioned that. So it becomes a perpetuating cycle of giving to people, because they're going to recommend you a guest. You're going to give them a shout out. You're going to let them know you gave them a shout out and gave them some more love. And then they're going to recommend more guests. And those people are going to recommend guests. So it's a constant way of giving to your network. So to wrap up the final question, it's an easy way to make it less awkward to end an interview. It creates warm introductions for you and creates great content. And then you're done. You just say, the conclusion is just, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time. Or it was great talking to you, Joe Smith, who's the author of blank or the CEO of blank. Thanks everyone. That's it. So that concludes the interview portion. So now you stop the recording. Okay. And the next thing is the post-interview steps. Now, if you keep scrolling down on this document, this is your checklist, right? Now, check out, we did a full separate video on the post-interview steps, okay? But just quickly, since you're already listening to this, you want to offer introductions, okay? You want to give first. Okay. You're already given by having them on your podcast. So you offer introductions, you ask the guest for introductions. And remember, we did a full video on this, so I won't go in the full details. You can offer a free assessment. You can offer nuggets of wisdom. You can reach out to all people or resources mentioned, which you should do. You want to thank the guest after the interview with an email, and you can give them something of value. So overall, if you think of the whole podcast process, if you booked an hour time, okay, you chit chat for 1 or 2 minutes, then you have a pre-interview that's 4 or 5 minutes, right? So you're at 6 to 7 minutes. The interview itself, let's say, takes around 30 minutes or so, right? So you're right around 37 or 40 minutes. So you can collaborate and chit chat for 5 or 10 minutes with a guest. Now you still have 10 minutes left in that hour. You want to upload the episode, right? Which takes less than 2 minutes. You just go to the upload form. and upload it right here, the file, and upload it. Okay. And then you want to make sure that you message the people and resources that you mention. Text the people that you mention, email the people that you mention. Okay. And then you are done. You're off to your next appointment. So just to reiterate, all of these are in here. How to rock an interview, the pre-interview section, the introduction, the sponsor message, the introduction of your guest, the interview questions, which you've done in the pre-interview, the final question, and the wrap up, and then all of the post-interview steps, right? That's it.